Today we're going to go over the First Legion, and therefore some of the first Space Marines ever created by the Emperor of Mankind, also known as the Dark Angels. This legion is actually so old that it was created during the Unification Wars, and some of these Space Marines actually helped take down some of the last Thunder Warriors. For much of the Great Crusade, their colors were black and red, and they were actually known as the Angels of Death rather than the Dark Angels. But eventually, all Space Marines would be known as the Emperor's Angels of Death. As the Emperor's very first Space Marine Legion, they were given exclusive access to vaults of ancient technology and weaponry that would help them face the unknown threats that would lie ahead. One of the defining characteristics of this legion is just how secretive they are. We don't know a whole lot about what the Dark Angels were doing at the beginning of the Great Crusade because a lot of their battles are shrouded in secrecy. There are even cases of the details of some of their battles having been erased completely. As more legions joined the Great Crusade, they looked to the First Legion for mentorship and guidance. This, along with the fact that they were so favored by the Emperor, made them very prideful. Eventually, the other Space Marine legions weren't just learning from the Dark Angels, they were improving upon their techniques and surpassing them. And a lot of the other Primarchs were found before Lionel Johnson was, and each time a Primarch was found, their legion would do way better, of course. So the Dark Angels became desperate to prove themselves, finding the strongest foes they could possibly find and taking them down no matter the cost. But they were relatively arrogant and restless, so even though they would get the job done, they would suffer heavy losses very often. Eventually, Lionel Johnson was found, and he was reunited with his Angels of Death, who he renamed the Dark Angels. This guy is the definition of on business. He does not let his feelings interfere, and he gets the job done no matter what. Before the Lion, the Dark Angels operated by spreading themselves rather thin because they were full of a bunch of specialized groups that could handle a bunch of different threats. And if the Dark Angels gathered, then you knew there was a big problem. So he went and collected all the Dark Angels companies and personally challenged the leader of each one to determine their worth. He judged people by their merit alone and reorganized the Legion in a way that made it much more effective and a fighting force to be reckoned with. The Legion's goal was still to annihilate their enemy completely, no matter the cost, but now that they had the Lion, they didn't suffer the same losses that they did before. Since the Second Legion is one of the two lost legions that we don't know anything about, let's talk about the Third Legion, the Emperor's Children. Early on in the Great Crusade, the Third Legion was guarding the Emperor when he was attacked. The Emperor was actually wounded pretty badly by some ancient powerful weapon that they had, but all the Emperor's children and the custodians fought to the death and protected the Emperor. In recognition of their sacrifice, the Emperor gave them the exclusive right to wear his Palatine Aquila on their chest, and they were informally known as the Emperor's Children. Their colors were purple and gold, and they represented the Emperor in a lot of ways. They were actually known as the Emperor's voice. The way that their gene seed affected their psychology meant that they could remember the exact meaning and intent of any orders given to them, and they could relay them to others. So it was also common for the Emperor to send the Third Legion out to relay his orders to legions and other Imperial forces throughout the galaxy. They were also just considered a great representation of the Empire. If there were emissaries or diplomats sent to a foreign power, they were often their bodyguards. Unfortunately, due to two separate incidents that no one really ever got to the bottom of, almost all of the Third Legion's reserve of gene seed was lost. First, the Emperor had just conquered a new facility that would allow him to create Space Marines way faster, so some of the Third Legion's gene seed was sent there. It could have been some remaining forces since they had just conquered that facility, but no one really knows. Then a virus somehow got into the gene vaults on Terra, and all the gene seeds started getting infected, but mostly the Third Legions. The Emperor himself actually had to step in and stop the virus, it was so bad. So while the other legions grew, especially now that this facility was up and running, the Third Legion kind of dwindled. Because without their Primarch and his DNA, they didn't have a way to make more gene seed. Luckily, their Primarch Fulgrim was eventually found and reunited with his legion. He officially renamed his legion the Emperor's Children, and he was very proud of the way that his legion was chosen to kind of represent the Empire. Now they could make more gene seed, and their numbers were growing again, but they still weren't large enough to fight on their own. So the Emperor had Fulgrim and his legion join his favored child, Horus's legion. Fulgrim and Horus worked together really well because their strengths kind of covered each other's weaknesses, and their legions worked together really well too. Eventually his legion was up to strength, and Fulgrim went forward with one goal in mind. Since Fulgrim saw the Emperor as perfect, the only way his legion would deserve the honors the Emperor had given them would be if they were perfect too. Now we're going to go over the Fourth Legion of the Great Crusade, the Iron Warriors. The augmentation process for becoming a Space Marine does not have a 100% survival rate. Your chances of surviving actually depend more on which gene seed you've been implanted with. And in the early days of the Great Crusade, no matter what your legion was, your chances of survival were even lower just because the technology hadn't been perfected yet. But the 4th Legion's gene seed has always had one of the highest rates of survival. So their legion got pretty big very early on in the Great Crusade, and they were one of the first 3 legions to really start crusading, along with the Dark Angels and the 5th Legion, the White Scars. It also meant that even if they took pretty big losses from a particular battle, they could replenish their numbers pretty quickly. And because of this kind of constant influx of new recruits, the Legion never really developed its own culture, and their tactics never changed either. Pretty much every other Legion evolved and developed new tactics as the Great Crusade went on, but the Iron Warriors stuck to the same tactics, even though it meant they were often in situations where none of their tactics were actually appropriate and they suffered great losses, because it became almost a source of pride that no matter how many losses they took, they could recover. But surprise, surprise, that actually backfired on them. They committed to an assault that pretty much unraveled as soon as it started, and they didn't pull back when they should have. They were known for being good at siege warfare because of the fact that they would relentlessly push forward no matter how many losses they took, and siege warfare usually meant a lot of losses. But they lost a ton of people in this assault, and a lot of them were their senior commanders. Their legion wasn't in danger of being wiped out or anything because of how good their gene seed was, but it kind of was a big stain on their reputation. Enter their Primarch, Perturabo. Perturabo is cold and calculating, and he was really not happy with his legion when he saw the state it was in. He used an ancient Roman punishment called decimation, where he had 1 of every 10 of his soldiers killed. This made his Marines desperate to prove themselves to him, and so he led them on a series of conquests that saw their numbers and firepower expand quickly. Now let's talk about the 5th Legion of the Great Crusade, the White Scars. Their colors are white and red, and they specialize in hit-and-run tactics, usually using these assault bikes. Whereas most of the other legions would sort of use massive amounts of firepower to roll over their enemies, the White Scars are agile and precise. Because of this, they were one of the first 3 legions, along with the Dark Angels and the Iron Warriors, to really start the Great Crusade. They were the pathfinders of the Great Crusade, so their legion was split into a bunch of pioneer companies and moved way ahead of the other legions to gather intel. They would show up, cause a lot of chaos, gather information, and then move forward. The unfortunate downside of this was that where other legions were forming brotherhoods, they were sort of a bunch of mixed companies that sometimes even had rivalries with one another. Eventually, their Primarch, Jagatai Khan, was found, and he made it his goal to unite his legion. And he knew that one of the best ways to do this would be with a shared culture, which the legion desperately needed. So he called them all to his homeworld and sort of introduced his world's culture to their legion. An important ritual in this culture is called the blooding, which involves making a cut on their face and then giving themselves a new name. And the scars from this ritual are where they got their name, the White Scars, from. The size, shape, and placement of their scars represented things like their tribe or their bloodline, but usually people that weren't White Scars or from their homeworld didn't really know what they meant. Jagatai Khan had personally conquered his world before the Emperor found him, so he wasn't actually trained that long, and he didn't know much about Imperial culture. Which also meant his legion wasn't really that connected to the Imperial culture and a lot of the other Space Marine legions, which shared that culture. And one of the most interesting differences between the White Scars and other legions has to do with their psychers. In almost every other legion, their psychers are called librarians, and one of their duties are to record the history of their legion. The people of their homeworld discovered a long time ago that there was some kind of otherworldly force that they could draw power from. They didn't know that it was the warp per se, but they did understand that there were certain dangers attached to drawing on its power. Psychers in the White Scars Legion are called Stormseers. They have abilities that librarians don't, and their respect and understanding of the warp also gives them a bit of an edge. And generally speaking, they are kind of better than librarians. Now we're going to talk about the 6th Legion of the Great Crusade, the Space Wolves. We don't know a ton about the early history of the Space Wolves Legion because it's one of 3 legions that were formed and established separately from the other legions for unknown reasons. The other 2 legions being the Salamanders and the Alpha Legion. Now, the fact that those 3 legions also happen to have gene seeds that have a really big effect on their physiology could be a factor, but again, there's really no knowing. One example of this being the teeth of the Space Wolf in this picture here. Early on, their gene seed didn't have a very high survival rate, so their legion was pretty slow to grow. So their legion was relatively late to join the Great Crusade, and also their legion's culture was slow to change, so their armor was kind of bland for a while. I already mentioned that Space Wolves have some animalistic qualities like their teeth, but it goes much deeper than that. During the earlier part of the Great Crusade, this legion was really hard to control and had a habit of getting carried away. Once they started fighting, it was pretty easy for them to get lost in the euphoria of battle, and any plans they had made began to fall apart pretty quickly. Because of this, their legion had one of the largest disciplinary corps of any of the other legions. A disciplinary corps is a collection of the more stable veteran members of a legion. The Adeptus Astartes were genetically engineered for war, so a lot of them like war, some of them too much. For some of the more, let's call them enthusiastic legions, it wasn't uncommon for some of their space marines to get caught up in the battle and end up posing a danger to their brothers or the mission. And that's when a member of the disciplinary corps would have to put them down. Luckily, their Primarch, Leman Russ, was the second to be found, and they were reunited with him pretty quickly. He brought the culture of his world, Fenris, to his legion, and it gave them discipline that they desperately needed. You could say that they went from a collection of ravenous animals to a pack of wolves that worked together. From an outside perspective, they still look really undisciplined because they're unlikely to listen to what you have to say unless you're part of their legion. But these Space Marines had learned to harness their anger and direct it at their foes when needed. One last thing I'd like to say about this legion is that, like the White Scars, they don't have librarians. Leman Russ really does not like psychers, so instead of librarians, they deploy rune priests. Even though rune priests are still technically psychers, they channel their warp powers through things like runes, talismans, and amulets. So they're not really drawing on the warp directly, and they're not really in danger from it. And as a matter of fact, a rune priest's abilities are really good for taking out demons. Now we're going to talk about the 7th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Imperial Fists. A lot of the other legions just wanted to defeat the enemy and expand the Imperium, but the Imperial Fists saw the Great Crusade for what it was, a series of conquests. They understood that conquering a planet was only half the fight. If you didn't reinforce that planet and make sure that you could hold on to it, what was the point? The Imperial Fists would pay any cost to tear down their enemies' defenses, defeat them, and then raise their own stronger defenses afterwards. They weren't just warriors, they were also builders, and their citadels were some of the strongest in the Imperium. The way that they would descend on an area and then grip it in an unbreakable fist is how they got their names pretty early on in the Great Crusade, the Imperial Fists. Eventually, their Primarch, Rogel Dorn, is found, and he immediately hits it off with the Emperor. Rogel Dorn's ideals were really closely aligned with what the Emperor wanted the Great Crusade to do for the Imperium, so he was fiercely loyal to the Emperor pretty quickly. Rogel Dorn took a good legion and made it great. So great, in fact, that Horus estimated that if he had to assault a fortress being held by Rogel and his Imperial Fists, it would probably never end, and it would just be a kind of eternal stalemate. The Emperor found the Imperial Fists so useful and reliable during the Great Crusade that he even made them part of his strategic reserve. After one of the largest battles in the entirety of the Great Crusade, called the Ulanor Crusade, the Emperor actually left the front lines and went back to Terra, taking the Imperial Fists with him. Which is also why the Emperor makes Horus the War Master of the Great Crusade while he's gone, because the Emperor has gone back to Terra for reasons unknown to the Primarchs. The Emperor had the Imperial Fists build his palace, and he made them his elite guard, so they became something kind of like the Space Marine equivalent of the Custodians. This is a huge honor, of course, because that means the Emperor believes he's safest if they are guarding him in a fortress that they've made. And by the way, this decision made Perturabo so angry. You might think that Perturabo and Rogel Dorn would get along because they both specialize in siege warfare. Perturabo is a cruel, cynical man who throws away as many lives as he can to get the job done. But since Rogel Dorn is an idealist that genuinely wants the world to be a better place and tries to save as many of his soldiers' lives as possible, he really doesn't see eye to eye with Perturabo. After it was finished, Rogel Dorn said he believed the Imperial Palace would be strong enough to withstand even the Iron Warriors, and that made Perturabo even more mad, because he's also kind of a big baby. Let's talk about the 8th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Night Lords. The Night Lords are pretty different from the other legions in several ways. One of those being that instead of recruiting people that they see as worthy and the best of the best, they recruit criminals that are cruel and ruthless. Even the way their gene seed changes them sets them apart from other legions. It makes their skin very pale, and they can see very, very well in the dark, but they're extremely sensitive to sunlight. So sensitive, in fact, that they have to wear light filters to protect their eyes in normal daylight. The Night Lords specialize in psychological warfare, so they do things like decorating their power armor in ways that make it as terrifying as possible. When the Emperor wanted to do more than just defeat someone, he sent the Night Lords. There are certain things, technologies, and warp abilities that the Emperor considers absolutely forbidden. So they were a punishment and a warning against committing some of the Emperor's most forbidden crimes. Eventually their Primarch, calling himself the Night Haunter, but also named Conrad Kurz, is found. And as a reminder, he has been cursed with just enough of the Emperor's ability to see into the future to only see the worst possible futures. And when Conrad saw the Emperor, he was struck with a vision so awful that he tried to claw his own eyes out before the Emperor actually stopped him. Conrad Kurz, as strange as it might sound, is actually a little like Batman. He genuinely hates bad people that do bad things, but he does terrible, terrible things to them so that other people will be too scared to repeat their mistakes. So when Conrad Kurz was reunited with his Space Marines, unlike the other Primarchs, he just genuinely did not like them. When the Emperor found Conrad, he had just spent years and years making everyone so scared that they wouldn't commit any crimes. His goal was to make his world a safer place, and he kind of succeeded in that. Then he was put in charge of a legion full of the exact kinds of people that he was just hunting down on his world. But oddly, even though Conrad did bring some order to the legion by improving their tactics, it didn't really seem like he ever did anything to make them not monsters. The Night Lords themselves and the things that they did to people were so gruesome and horrific that if someone heard that the Night Lords had been sent after them, it wasn't uncommon for them to just immediately submit to whatever the Emperor wanted. As time went on, what little control Conrad had over the Night Lords was being lost, and he had had it with his legion. And to make matters worse, he learned that in his absence, his homeworld had gone right back to the way it was. And he actually blew up his home planet, which is typically where a Primarch draws the majority of their recruits from. Now let's go over the 9th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Blood Angels. Their gene seed has a couple quirks that sets their legion apart from the others. For instance, even though most gene seeds have an effect on how a Space Marine looks, the 9th Legion's gene seed changes them a lot. For whatever reason, the 9th Legion tends to recruit from the deformed, people that are irradiated, scarred, and deformed. But the Blood Angels are generally described as having very striking or beautiful features. The gene seed changes their physicality so much that the process is actually pretty painful, and it's not uncommon for it to be too much for some Space Marine aspirants to bear and pass away. And since this legion actually has kind of a vampire theme, they're usually also very pale, and as they get older, their canines will grow longer. And although every Space Marine has an organ that allows them to gain some of the memories of an animal that they eat, it's very strong for the 9th Legion. So new Blood Angels could be trained pretty quickly by eating their enemies. They also have a ritual that tends to confuse outsiders, where if one of their higher officers dies in combat, one of them will consume some of him and then assume his name. They do this to honor their fallen comrade, but since a lot of the members of the 9th Legion look similar to outsiders, it's led to the misconception that members of their legion are immortal and have lived for thousands and thousands of years. The Blood Angels were pretty successful early in the Great Crusade, and this made them very prideful. Eventually, their pride got them into a situation that saw massive losses for them, and their legion got way smaller. So they adapted their tactics and specialized in shock assaults, where they would just appear out of nowhere with all the firepower. But the fact that their legion was so small now meant that they were kind of desperate, and they became bloodthirsty and savage, and the things that they did in this fight and a lot of the fights up until their Primarch was found gave them a terrible reputation with the other legions. They were essentially devolving into bloodthirsty vampires. Eventually, their Primarch Sanguinius is found, though, and he recognizes the darkness in his legion as something that came from him. Because although he is known as being one of the most noble Primarchs, he does have a legendary rage. So he led them through a series of conquests where they learned discipline and honor, and they became one of the most honorable of all the legions. Today we're going to be talking about the 10th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Iron Hands. The 10th Legion proved itself pretty early in the Great Crusade by being very successful against heavy resistance in terrible conditions. And they were also known to be pretty solid strategists because they were able to take out a huge force of orcs while only losing less than a fifth of their legion. And in that battle, they were fighting orcs almost non-stop for days. So the way that the 10th Legion could just kind of persist no matter how bad it got meant that they began to specialize in set-piece battles as the Great Crusade went on. So essentially, if you were going to have a war of attrition between two massive forces in an open battle, you wanted the Iron Hands on your side. Eventually, Ferrus Manus is found, and as it usually goes, he began to reshape his legion. Ferrus Manus was pretty good friends with his brother Fulgrim because they both had their own kind of way of appreciating perfection. And for Ferrus Manus, that basically meant that he would not tolerate any weakness. Under Ferrus Manus, the 10th Legion began to essentially hate failure and weakness. They saw it as something that should be dealt with proactively before it had a chance to endanger anyone. So whether that meant an ally that they were fighting alongside, one of their aspirants, or even a Space Marine from their own legion, they would purge that weakness if they had a chance. Therefore, they saw that removal of weakness as a way of strengthening their own legion. When it came to making his legion stronger, Ferrus Manus didn't just care about people, though. He also cared about their war gear. Ferrus Manus was good at figuring out how technology worked, and an accomplished smith, so under his tutelage, his legion grew in those ways too. And the fact that they were often deployed alongside the Mechanicum, who are essentially the Imperial engineers, they gained a lot of tech. And it wasn't just tech either. The Mechanicum and the 10th Legion became pretty close friends, and they exchanged all kinds of information, which made the 10th Legion even stronger. Another thing that changed once the 10th Legion found its Primarch was the way that they saw honor. Whereas they were once seen as heroes because of the way that they could use their tactical minds to reduce losses, that changed. They prioritized getting the job done, and if you didn't make it, it's because you weren't strong enough in their opinion. They cared so little for honor, in fact, that they didn't even record all of their battles as the Great Crusade went on because they just couldn't be bothered. The 11th Legion is one of the Lost Legions, so today we're going to talk about the 12th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the World Eaters. They were originally called the Warhounds, and they earned that name pretty quickly just because of how absolutely savage and brutal they would be in battle. They generally cared more about taking out as many of their enemies as they could than they did about their own safety, so it made them pretty unsuitable for any mission that didn't have an objective of completely wiping out the enemy. They even had to institute all kinds of harsh codes of punishment because they loved fighting so much, they were prone to fighting with each other. Eventually, Angron is discovered, and everything gets much better. Just kidding, everything gets way worse. He set up all kinds of gladiatorial arenas and fighting pits and had them fight with real knives and live ammo. And he also went to his apothecaries and tech marines to try to get them to replicate his butcher's nails, which, in case you don't remember, is this implant on his head that boosts his strength and aggression but deadens any emotion but rage. So his main priority at this point was just to get his legion as powerful as possible, no matter the cost, because his butcher's nails basically tormented him. Angron's implants are ancient tech that the Imperium didn't fully understand though, so there was a lot of trouble in trying to create a copy that wouldn't just kill a space marine. To make matters worse, Angron also instituted a new rule. Whenever they went to conquer a world, if it took them longer than 31 hours, the legion would face the punishment of decimation, which is an ancient Roman punishment in which 1 of every 10 soldiers is killed by the other 9 with their bare hands. The rule was kind of ridiculous because the legion was rarely able to actually meet that deadline and they were decimated often. Eventually, one of the veterans from the old Warhound days had a problem with the direction that the World Eaters were going in under Angron's rule. He refused to see his legion decimated any further, and this defiance made Angron so mad that he flew into a rage that could only be stopped when his own librarians psychically knocked him unconscious. While Angron's unconscious, the apothecaries of the World Eaters are finally able to successfully duplicate the Butcher's Nails implant. There was a kind of civil war in the Legion between those that did not want to see the Butcher's Nails used and those that did, and those that didn't lost. So all the World Eaters are implanted with Butcher's Nails, and this makes the other Primarchs and the Emperor pretty mad, because he just turned a bunch of Space Marines into mindless, superpowered killers. Now let's talk about the 13th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Ultramarines. The 13th Legion gained the nickname the Warborn pretty early on because of how their recruits were chosen. They typically recruited from the most militant forces of any world they conquered, so if you fought the hardest, they were probably going to recruit from you. The effects of the 13th Legion's gene seed were pretty subtle, but it made them really rounded soldiers. Like most other Space Marine legions, they were very aggressive and determined to complete their goal no matter what. But unlike a lot of other legions, they were able to restrain themselves when necessary. And some legions are more prone to fighting than others for whatever reason, but this legion displayed a lot of cohesion and an almost pathological demand to complete any goal given to them. Their level of self-restraint, added to the fact that you knew that they would do what was asked of them, meant that they were often used as disciplinarians, both for other legions and for human forces. As the Great Crusade continued, their tactics evolved a lot. They specialized in imitation and adaptation. So basically that meant if the 13th Legion saw another force, whether that was allies or enemies, doing something better than they did it, they would imitate them and take their tactics for themselves. So where some legions prioritized simply conquering the enemy as fast as they could and moving on, they prioritized things like reducing casualties and collateral damage. As the Great Crusade pushed on, the 13th Legion's tactics and gene seed allowed them to grow to become the biggest of all the legions. Their gene seed was able to help them expand so quickly, not because of the fact that it had a higher chance of successfully being implanted into a Space Marine, but because of the fact that it wouldn't mutate very much. When the Emperor made the Space Marine legions, he had to use the DNA from the Primarchs while they were infants, and because of that, for whatever reason, it made their gene seeds more unstable. Each new generation of gene seeds taken from a Space Marine had a certain chance of being mutated based on which legion you came from. Those rates were relatively low for most of those legions until their Primarchs were found and their gene seed could be stabilized. Eventually, their Primarch, Reboot Guilliman, is found, and he takes a great legion and makes it even more amazing. He had a passion for statecraft and governing, so he actually had a small empire already going when the Emperor found him. His sort of empire within an empire was known as Ultramar, which is where they got their name, the Ultramarines, from. So now that their Primarch was leading them, he understood the importance of staying behind and rebuilding a conquered world slightly before you move on. And he made them part of a supply chain that allowed his legion to go where no other legion was actually allowed to go, the intergalactic core. It's regarded as one of the most dangerous and unstable places in the galaxy, and only they were allowed to explore it. Let's go over the 14th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Death Guard. They were originally known as the Dusk Raiders because of the way that they would attack at dusk so that all the moving shadows would help cover their advance. Similar to the Iron Hands Legion, they were very resilient. They were put in some terrible situations and some terrible environments, and they were still able to push through and endure. The Dusk Raiders fought on the Great Crusade for about 80 years before their Primarch was found, but eventually he was. And it was at this point that he renamed the Dusk Raiders to the Death Guard. Mortarion was found on a planet called Barbarous, which is a planet completely covered in poison gases. So even though his gene seed already made his Space Marines durable, he knew that they could be more durable. When Mortarion was found, he had already been fighting a war on this hazardous planet for quite a while, so he understood the importance of this kind of toxic biological warfare. He did all kinds of things like exposing his Space Marines to harsh environments or certain toxins to make them more resistant to them, and they became more durable than any other Space Marine Legion. And to make his legion even more durable, Mortarion chose to almost exclusively recruit from Barbarous. Because as you might expect, after generations of living on a planet with terrible conditions like that, the people of Barbarous had a kind of durability that couldn't be matched. They went places that other Space Marines couldn't and fought with weapons that other legions considered kind of distasteful, like radiation weapons. And where the Dusk Raiders typically protected the weak from oppression, the Death Guard saw people that were weak as unworthy of their time, because ultimately they had become overly proud of their endurance. It should also be noted that Mortarion really does not like Psykers. So he had the Librarius removed from his chapter, and there are no Librarians or Psykers of any kind in the Death Guard. Let's talk about the 15th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Thousand Suns. When the Thousand Suns were first created, a bunch of warp storms appeared. If you think of the warp like an ocean, then a warp storm is essentially a part of that water that is violently churning and swirling around, making it very dangerous. Depending on how bad the warp storm is, it can make traveling through the warp really difficult or even impossible. And if it's really bad, then it can even bleed through into real space and start affecting the real world, like when the Thousand Suns were created. Luckily though, their gene seeds weren't actually affected by these warp storms. Later on, when their Primarch Magnus found out about this, he understood it to be more of a warning than something that actually went wrong. It's generally thought that they're called the Thousand Suns because the Emperor made exactly 1,000 of them first, for some reason, before bringing them up to the full strength of a legion and sending them out on the Great Crusade. Whatever the reason though, the Emperor named them the Thousand Suns as they set out on the Great Crusade, and for 5 years, things were relatively normal. Then, almost every member of the Legion starts developing psychic powers if they didn't already have them. However, as their new powers were developing, some of them would randomly burst into horrifying mutations that they began to call the Flesh Change. Those that began to experience the flesh change were put into stasis in the hopes that one day it could be reversed, and those that didn't experience the flesh change were generally the strongest of the Psykers. Their legion's numbers got pretty low, but then eventually their Primarch, Magnus the Red, is found. The Thousand Suns, who had been traveling with the Emperor, were left on Magnus's homeworld of Prospero with him while the Emperor went on to continue the Great Crusade. But once the Emperor left, the flesh change, which was already pretty bad and destroying their legion, just grew out of control and began to afflict almost every member of their legion. So either the Emperor was holding the flesh change in check somehow, or some other forces were now taking advantage of them and making it worse now that the Emperor's protection was gone. Desperate to save his legion, Magnus turns to the warp and makes a deal with an entity that he did not know at the time was actually the Chaos God Tzeentch. Because of this deal, Magnus is given the knowledge to stabilize his legion's gene seed, and they're finally able to start the Great Crusade. The Thousand Suns mainly conquer worlds by using trickery and guile, but if that fails, of course they use their psychic abilities. And because of this, they're actually able to conquer a bunch of worlds without taking many losses, which is very fortunate for this relatively small legion. But there were a lot of legionaries and primarchs who didn't like Psykers and really didn't like people that avoided open conflict and did not like the Thousand Suns at all. Let's talk about the 16th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Luna Wolves. They gained a reputation pretty early on for being the Emperor's wolves because of the way he would use them for shock assaults. They would quickly approach their target at night or at dawn, and then before they knew it, they would be face to face with the 16th Legion. And the battle would basically be over before everyone even realized they were being attacked. And it was after their efforts to conquer the moon, also known as Luna, that they finally became known as the Luna Wolves. And then in almost no time at all, the 16th Legion's Primarch, Horus, is found. It took quite a while for more Primarchs to be found, so for several years it was just Horus and the Emperor. They grew extremely close, closer than any of the other Primarchs would really get to the Emperor, and he was known as sort of being the Emperor's protege. The planet that Horus was found on was called Chthoniya, and there were quite a few violent gangs there. Once a Space Marine Legion is reunited with their Primarch, it's pretty common for them to begin recruiting mostly from that Primarch's home planet. So the 16th Legion began to pull its recruits from Chthoniya, and along with them came Chthonian culture, which is why you see things like top knots and mohawks on Luna Wolves pretty often. It wasn't uncommon for a Space Marine Legion to become so specialized in a certain area of combat that they became less efficient at other types of combat. But the Luna Wolves took efforts to make sure that they stayed flexible so that no matter what the situation, they would excel. Although when possible, they still had a preference for those massive shock assaults that the Emperor used them for early on. This legion became such a force of nature that it actually became relatively common for them to conquer an entire star system in one encounter. They would enter a system with their warships in a massive spear formation that would split off into a bunch of smaller spears that would systematically identify and take out their target's biggest threats. And they would coordinate their movements with other members of the 16th Legion to sort of circle and trap their target to make sure that it couldn't receive help from the outside or escape. Which isn't that unlike actual wolves, honestly. They also had a tendency to kind of get along with any of the other legions and work alongside them very efficiently, which is not common for a lot of the legions. Some legions weren't that nice to people they didn't hate, and other legions had rivalries and bad blood with all kinds of other legions. But the Luna Wolves could generally fight alongside any of their brothers without any problems, and Horus had a particular talent with using the other legions' skills. Let's go over the 17th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Word Bearers. They were originally named the Imperial Heralds, and where most Space Marine legions kind of earned their names later on, they were actually named the Imperial Heralds from their very founding. And that was because the Emperor had a very specific duty for the 17th Legion in mind from their very creation, and that was the elimination of any kind of ideal or belief that contradicted the Imperial truth. And just as a refresher for anyone that doesn't remember what the Imperial truth is, it's sort of the ideals that the Emperor has for the new Imperium of Man. He saw religion as something that motivated people to do some pretty terrible things throughout history, so he wanted to avoid it. Thus, the Imperial truth is kind of more about logic and reason than anything else. Generally, all Space Marines are incredibly loyal and dedicated to the Emperor, but the Word Bearers were different. Their gene seed almost made them like zealots, which is part of what made them perfect for eliminating anything that would oppose the ideals that they held dearest. The most dedicated of the Imperial Heralds were given this black armor with a skull helm and this eagle mace. Before the Word Bearers actually showed up and attacked anyone, they would send in these guys to spread the word about the Imperial truth and warn them about the dangers of not abandoning their beliefs. And true to their word, after they conquered a place, they would typically go through the libraries and burn any books that were contrary to the Imperial truth and destroy any temples they could find. Eventually, their Primarch, Lorgar, is found, ironically, on a deeply religious planet with a pantheon of gods that are, unknown to them, the Chaos Gods. Lorgar deeply believed that the Emperor was a god, and the Emperor hated this, which only made Lorgar believe him more, because who else but a god would deny that they're a god? Lorgar even wrote a document that expressed his quote-unquote logical basis for believing that the Emperor was a god. So even though the Emperor hated this, he tolerated it for a while because they were showing results, and that was all that really mattered to him. But under Lorgar's leadership, the 17th Legion changed a lot. For instance, the importance of ceremony and ritual became much more important. The duties of those Imperial Heralds that I mentioned before with the black armor and the skull helmet were changed, and they became known as chaplains. And instead of just arriving at a planet before the 17th Legion did and announcing their arrival, the chaplains would fight with the 17th Legion in battles. Lorgar renamed the Imperial Heralds to the Word Bearers as they became more and more religious, and then he also began to convert all of the worlds that they conquered to believe in the Emperor as a god. But it took a lot of time to establish these religions, and they began to slow down a lot and conquered fewer and fewer worlds than any of the other legions. Like I said before, the Emperor only cared about results, and that's when he noticed, and he got really mad at Lorgar. He took the Ultramarines with him as a kind of disciplinary force, and they destroyed their most holy planet right in front of the Word Bearers. Let's talk about the 18th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Salamanders. Originally named the Dragon Warriors, the Salamanders were one of 3 legions, along with the Space Wolves and Alpha Legion, that was formed in secrecy away from the other legions. Those legions are pretty strongly affected by their gene seeds, so that could be part of it, but we really just don't know. The fact that the other legions didn't know much about those 3 mysterious legions and also were kept at a distance from them made them sort of wary towards them. But the Salamanders were able to overcome this at a great cost. In one of the last battles of the Unification War, the Salamanders were almost completely wiped out from a force of 20,000 soldiers down to almost 1,000. The odds were completely against them in this battle, so the fact that they were able to survive at all earned them the respect of pretty much every other legion. The Dragon Warriors tried to replenish their losses as quickly as they could, but that kind of thing takes time, and it would be a while before they were up to a strength that allowed them to take part in the Great Crusade like the other legions did. Instead, as each new Dragon Warrior chapter was trained, they were sent out to try to help any of the mortal forces that were struggling in the new Imperium. Because conquering a world didn't just mean it was yours now, you had to be able to hold on to it and protect it. So the Salamanders were sent anywhere that a Space Marine's power would be needed to help reinforce some humans. So whereas a lot of other legions had a tendency to look down on humans as less than them, the Salamanders fought alongside them so often that they really didn't see them that way. Their experiences helped them understand that those were the people they were actually fighting for. So among human soldiers, they gained a reputation as being saviors, but also a warning that a terrible fight was going to be coming, because if you needed Space Marine power, that was bad. But luckily, because of their reputation and their smaller numbers, they were often given access to advanced war gear before other legions were. Eventually, a part of the Imperium way behind the front lines is attacked by a massive fleet of orcs, and since most of the other legions are on the front lines, the only ones that can actually react to them are the Dragon Warriors. So all the Dragon Warrior chapters were gathered there, and for once they actually fought as a legion against all these orcs, but it was going pretty rough. Unknown to the legion, their Primarch Vulcan had actually been found by the Emperor some time ago and had been training under him. But once he learned about the situation his legion was in, he went out to help them, and he brought a lot of reinforcements with him. And since one of the things he had gained from training with the Emperor was an understanding of how technology works, he also brought a bunch of new custom war gear that really helped turn the tides. After the battle, the 18th Legion gathered before their Primarch for the first time, and he showed his humility by actually kneeling to his own legion. And he renamed the 18th Legion the Salamanders after these massive dragon-like creatures on his home planet. Let's talk about the 19th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Raven Guard. The Raven Guard specialized in stealth, reconnaissance, and infiltration. They would study their enemies and identify their key targets, like leadership, important defenses, and infrastructure. And then they would attack them where they least expected it and when they least expected it. If an enemy was expected to fight back instead of joining the Emperor's Imperium, then the Raven Guard would usually be sent. And if that enemy actually made the decision to fight back against the Emperor, then by the time that decision was made, the Raven Guard would reveal themselves and the fact that they were already targeting everything that they would need to actually win a fight. It was at this point that most enemies decided to give up. If they couldn't use that tactic for whatever reason, then they would usually rely on a series of relentless hit-and-run tactics that would give their enemy absolutely no time to regroup. It should also be noted that the 19th Legion's gene seed can affect their Space Marine's appearance quite a bit. Some had very pale skin or extremely dark hair, and a few even had eyes that were completely black. These were of course physical traits that their Primarch also had, but it would be a while before he was found, and until then, they were pretty close to the Luna Wolves. The way that the Luna Wolves fought worked really well with how the 19th Legion fought. When the Luna Wolves would launch a sudden assault, the Raven Guard would already be in position ready to back them up. So Horus loved when the 19th Legion was available to support his own, to the point that some even observed that the 19th Legion was sort of treated as more of a chapter of the Luna Wolves by Horus. Eventually, their Primarch, Corvus Corax, is found, and when he observes them fighting, he really doesn't love how cold and ruthless they are. His home planet had been ruled by tyrants and oppressors that he had actually just gone to great lengths to get rid of, and so you can understand why he'd be pretty upset when his legion reminded them of those people. So he did things like replacing high-ranking officers with legionaries that he knew would align more with his ideals. The 19th Legion also gained quite a few perks when they found their Primarch in the form of all kinds of custom stealth tech. Because they didn't just have access to the technology from the Mechanicum, which was the Imperial engineers, they also had their own engineers. Corvus Corax's home planet happens to also be the home of a guild of very skilled artificers. So, on top of the fact that the Mechanicum was making custom stuff for the 19th Legion, the artificers actually had a bunch of secrets the Mechanicum didn't know, and they were able to make things the Mechanicum couldn't. Which means that the Raven Guard has access to tech that none of the other legions could get even if they wanted. Unfortunately though, their legion would suffer a pretty big loss. They were part of a rather massive war along with the Iron Warriors, the Space Wolves, and the Luna Wolves. In a war council, it was decided that they would assault the enemy head-on, and Corvus thought that that was a terrible idea. He had a plan that involved a series of feints that drew the enemy away, but the other Primarchs really didn't care for it. They accused him of trying to avoid a battle, which is a pretty big insult for a Primarch, and then they pretty much ignored him. Corvus was right though. A lot of Space Marines were lost in that assault, but mostly Raven Guard Marines. So for most of the other legions, it was a victory, but his legion was pretty much decimated, and he refused to ever work with the Luna Wolves or Horus ever again. Let's go over the 20th Space Marine Legion of the Great Crusade, the Alpha Legion. The Alpha Legion is one of 3 legions, along with the Space Wolves and the Salamanders, that seems to have been created separately from the other legions. Because those three legions have gene seeds with pretty unique characteristics, it's thought that they were created for some particular purpose, but there's really no way to be sure. This legion is probably the most mysterious and confusing of all the legions. For starters, we know almost nothing about this legion starting from their creation up until several decades into the Great Crusade. One of the things we do know about the early history of the Legion is that there are no official records of them ever being ordered to expand to a size they would need to be at to go on the Great Crusade. During the initial creation of a Space Marine Legion, a small group of neophytes would be implanted with a gene seed, and then each time that was successful, a larger group of neophytes would be implanted. And the last of these preliminary stages is called the Alpha Induction, which is kind of considered the first non-experimental group of Space Marines of that Legion. The fact that there are no records of them ever having moved past this Alpha stage is probably why their Legion is called the Alpha Legion. But again, we can't really know. We also don't really know how they were able to get from this force of around 1,000 to 3,000 soldiers to the Legion that they became later on. But a big part of it is probably because of the fact that their Legion's gene seed is supposed to have the highest success rate of any of the gene seeds. We also know that from their battlefield tests that they were exceptional soldiers, like even for a Space Marine. That, along with the fact that some of the 20th Legion's enhancements would later be developed into a process used to create the Custodes, makes it possible that the word Alpha in the name Alpha Legion means supreme. They are the Alpha. Because the Alpha Legion's Space Marines are also pretty tall for Space Marines because they're tall enough to impersonate their Primarch. In fact, they do it a lot. It's one of the things that makes them really confusing. They don't really ever use their names. They use the name of their Primarch, Alfarius, or one of many. They were known to obfuscate or remove any kind of heraldry on their armor so you wouldn't know who they were when they went on covert operations, and in fact, it's even thought that they might have had something to do with what happened to the 3rd Legion's gene seed. Because of their mysterious nature, they were also known as the Ghost Legion for quite a while. Because of what I mentioned before, we really don't know when their Primarch was found or reunited with his Legion, but they were at some point. Although I say the Primarch, there are actually two Primarchs that share one soul, Alfarius and Omegon. But of course, as you might expect, a lot of people don't even know Omegon exists, and they take turns sort of pretending to be Alfarius. Their Legion was also compared to a Hydra pretty often, one of those reasons being that when you took down one of their Legionaries, two seemingly identical Legionaries would take their place. But it probably also has a little bit to do with their fighting style, which is a little bit insane. First, they would infiltrate their enemy and start sabotaging them in a number of ways that would spread confusion and panic, in some instances even having them fight each other. Then, once the enemy was thoroughly confused, the 20th Legion would jump out from a billion directions at once and attack them using a variety of different tactics, causing total chaos. See, the 19th Legion used stealth to avoid casualties, but the 28th Legion just did it for fun and for a game, almost. In fact, later in the Great Crusade, there were even instances of them not attacking worlds they probably should have because it didn't look like it would be enough of a challenge to them.